Jen Banka. I see her.
Hello all. Welcome. Thank you for coming. Can everybody hear me? Okay, coming through. Thank you so much for being here, to all of you, to Cathy Cook, to David Wilk. This is just fantastic. I'm Mike Wenton, the program director at Woodland Pattern. I was about to say here at Woodland Pattern, but that's not where I am right now. So at the outset here, we at Woodland Pattern would like to acknowledge that operating here in Milwaukee, as we do, we're on traditional Potawatomi, Ho-Chunk, and Menominee homeland along the southwest shores of Michigami, North America's largest system of freshwater lakes, where the Milwaukee, Menominee, and Kinnickinnic rivers meet, and the people of Wisconsin's sovereign Anishinaabe, Ho-Chunk, Menominee, Oneida, and Mohican nations remain present. I'm going to admit a couple more people from the waiting room. So thank you. Okay, and yeah, once again, thank you so much to Cathy Cook and David Wilk. And I do want to say thanks, Cathy, for sharing Immortal Cupboard via Vimeo for folks to watch ahead of time. That seems more reliable than trying live playback. So I'm glad for people to have had a chance to see the film. It will be available to view until 12 p.m. Central Time tomorrow, in case you haven't had a chance to watch or want to watch again, which of course you should. So I'm gonna share here. It's all over the place on our website and elsewhere, but I'll still share here with you all. I'll chat at you the link to that so you can watch again and again, many times before tomorrow at noon. And then I hope that you'll stay up to date with us. Of course, all programs, Woodland Pattern programs, have moved online for the foreseeable future. So you can come see us on our website, woodlandpattern.org, a brand new website, just launched last week. Or else sign up for our e-newsletter, social media, and so on. We've got a lot of great stuff coming up. Pretty near at hand are our NEA Big Read programs centered on Advice from the Lights, fantastic poetry collection by Stephanie Burt. That will be throughout May and into early June, among many other amazing things coming up. So stay tuned and follow us. In order to create the greatest access to our programming, we have adopted a give what you can ticketing model. With this in mind, I'll say that if you're in a position to give, we'd be deeply grateful for your support. And if you are in a position, I'm once again going to chat at you. Here it is, this link here. I'll take you to a page where you can donate if, again, you are in a position to do so. And thank you so much. And thank you simply for being here, which is, of course, an incredibly important form of support in itself. So we are still selling books through Woodland Pattern, at Woodland Pattern, so you can get them by mail, or we do have contactless pickup a couple of days a week. These include, of course, all the books we have, but notably books by David Wilk and Lorraine Niedecker, related to today's programs. Right? I'm going to chat one more thing to you, and that is the information for our book center manager, Peter Brzezinski, peterb@woodlandpattern.org, in case you're interested in making a purchase. Peter is the person to be in touch with. Okay. And then just some things to mention before we get going here, which I will stop in a moment and we can hear from Cathy and David. But just to let you all know, this event is being recorded and will be shared via our website and elsewhere, just so you're aware that that's happening. And then we'll begin with some conversation between Cathy Cook and David Wilk, but then we will open things up for questions from you all, and we can talk more about that process at that time. But basically, if your video is running, which many of you have your video running, and that's great, you can just raise your actual physical IRL hand. And if you choose to keep your video off, which is perfectly fine, then you can there's a hand raise icon, like function built into Zoom. when we get to that point, and I'll talk about that again. Okay, so we're incredibly fortunate to have artist, filmmaker, educator, and eco-activist Cathy Cook, who has been creating films, animation, poetry films, collages, and installations since the early 80s. She has exhibited her award-winning work internationally in both solo and group shows, including MoMA, the Whitney Museum, PBS, and numerous other venues. In 2001, she was awarded a Guggenheim Memorial Fellowship. Nature, topical social issues, and poetry have been staples in her creative work. Cook's Cranes in Motion project took her to the largest migration locations for sandhill cranes and whooping cranes. She's currently an associate professor in visual arts, cinematic arts at UMBC, and of course created the amazing film that we're going to hear more about, Immortal Cupboard. And David Wilk is a poet, editor, publisher, and publishing consultant. He was editor and publisher of Truck Magazine and Truck Press, and currently operates Frederator Books and City Point Press. Wilk was also literature program director at the National Endowment for the Arts in the Carter administration. His poetry and nonfiction has been published in literary magazines and by independent presses, most recently, including Lorraine Niedecker, The Poet in Her Place, which was published in cooperation with the Friends of Lorraine Niedecker and Woodland Pattern, and Archaeology of Light, a chapbook that was published on Woodland Pattern imprint Tinder Tender. He is on the board of CLMP, Community of Literary Magazines and Presses, podcasts about books and publishing at writerscast.com, and provides publishing and consulting services for a variety of clients. He is currently editing a Truck at 50 collection to be published in fall of 2020. I hope that's still on track to be fall of 2020, but that's really exciting. Okay, now I will stop talking, mute myself, and turn things over. Thank you so much, Cathy and David.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Mike. So we decided that we would basically just have a conversation. And so we'll talk for a little bit and then ask anyone who wants to say anything just to raise your hand. Mike will call on you. And but mainly, this is really just nothing formal. We're trying to get used to what this forum is. And it's, we all kind of wish we were there in the same room together, but we'll pretend that we are this way. So, Cathy, I think the film is really amazingly evocative and powerful. I know you made it quite a number of years ago, but one of the first questions I just wanted to ask you was, what's your history of interest in Maureen's work? What prompted you to spend, which I know it's got to have been a lot of time to make this film. Yeah. What got you going to do that?
I had been making short poetry films for quite a while. Some were animated, some were done with photography, some were done with 16 millimeter film. And I really enjoyed that format. As I finished my last batch of short films, my friend Jen Benka, who is here today, came by and said, "Here," and she held up the granite pail, and she handed it to me, and she said, "I think this might be your next project." And I didn't put it down. I read it from cover to the end, from the front to back. I just didn't stop. And what was so striking to me is how much, as a Wisconsin native, how much of her imagery resonated with me. And I was, by poem, I was accumulating images in my head. So I thought, if I was reacting that way to that one book, and I knew she had more poetry, that maybe this should be my next project. So it was an immediate correspondence of provoking my imagery for myself as well. And also being aware that I was in sync with some of her visionary observations.
So, and I sort of look at the film itself sets out to be an a kind of impressionistic examination. The sort of the subtitle, "In Search of Lorraine Niedecker," tells you that you're trying to figure out who she is, or
right,
who she was, or what the poems are. And I think that, you know, I was really struck by the use of the feet, you know, because we have so few images of her to work with. I assume that you know, you use that in order to carry us through, representing both. It sort of represents your search, but also it's who she was. She didn't drive; she walked everywhere, and I thought that was really powerful and effective.
Well, one of the reasons I did have so much walking is for the exact reasons that you just mentioned. But in my mind, I imagined that that's when she was exploring. That's where she was gathering her images early in the morning. It wasn't just to have a nice walk. It was literally her study. And that's why oftentimes she's touching in the film, she's touching things, she's turning things over, she's bending down and picking things up. It's what I imagined her doing on her daily walks.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And so, how much time did you end up having to spend, or wanting to spend? I don't mean by an obligation, but how much time did you spend in Fort Atkinson, you know, in Black Hawk, near the river and the lake? Obviously, a lot of time there.
Well, I did spend a lot of time there, but once I understood what the terrain was like, I also understood that there were a lot of substitutions that I could use to film that looked just like her area. And ironically, one of those places is the lake that I live on, that's between Green Bay and Stevens Point. And it has a lot of marsh. There's a lot of wetlands around it. The terrain is so similar that it matched almost identically to some of the areas that I found around Black Hawk Island. But I did go out there many, many times. And sometimes I spent just a couple hours there, and sometimes I spent an entire day there. I also took Paul Dickinson out there to do audio recording. He is the sound recordist for all the natural nature sounds. So he was very important to capture some of the things that Lorene talked about in her poetry. So if you don't hear it, if you don't see it on the page, or if I don't make a point of it, oftentimes it came through the audio.
Well, I thought the audio was very important, obviously, as you did too.
Yes.
But I think it helps to try to understand her work, to understand her environment.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that the sound is something that if you don't go to the place, if you haven't ever been able to be there, the sound of what it's like to be on the water would not necessarily be clear to you. So I think it's really powerful for those of us who don't get to go there to hear it and to feel it, you know, in the way that she did.
Yeah, and it is encompassing because the island, Black Hawk Island, is basically a peninsula, but it often feels like an island because there's water surrounding every side of it, more or less. And when there's a flood, then it is an island. But you do have neighboring marshes that have different sounds coming from, say, maybe the pelicans that are in that pond, and then you get the sounds resonating off of the river, and then there's just people sounds, and then there's ambient sounds in general, higher up and lower down in the terrain. And so it really is a 360 experience because the terrain is so different, because the area is so different. Yeah.
And also, I thought, you know, it relates somewhat to the writing itself. You know, the poetry is auditory, but when you read it, you have to listen to it for yourself. You're not, you know, and in fact, you play that rare recording of Lorene reading. I think it's the only reading that exists of her, the only recording of her voice. And interestingly, she did not really believe in poetry as read out loud. She thought you should read it on the page. But it is so interesting to hear her voice. I also thought that you treated the poetry respectfully in putting it on the screen without having it be read to you.
Mm-hmm. And that was very conscious. I respected the fact that she felt strongly about having poetry on the page, having it be received by the viewer on the page and not be read out loud. So there's very few times where it's actually read out loud. That was a hard rule to follow, because what it did was it eliminated a lot of longer poems. I had a very strict, it was just restricting into the length of poetry that I could choose from. So there were longer poems that I would have loved to have included, but it didn't fit that format to be able to read it on film. Yeah.
Were you worried that if you put just the text on the screen for a long poem, that it would be too hard for people, that it doesn't work in the form? Is that what you mean?
Yes, yes. It was very difficult. For example, if I were to take the Lake Superior poems, which are pages and pages and pages, how do you do that visually in a moving format? It would be very difficult. And if somebody were to read it, that's one thing. But to have it on the screen, I think it's very difficult for people to read it continuously for that long without taking a break. People, when you're reading it off the page, you take a break. Sometimes you reread lines. Sometimes you read part of it and then go back and start over again. There's a personal relationship there. And when you have a screen version of it, it's all one time. There's a set time to it. So you don't have that intimate relationship with the poetry.
Right. Although on the screen, the short poems actually work really well, because seeing them up in front of you and giving us time to read them, kind of feel them. I thought that was really important. It actually highlighted some of the poems for me that, they were right there in front of me. What I mean? They kind of brought them to life in a really interesting way. I wasn't expecting that.
Oh,
okay. So I guess some other questions that, maybe you could talk a little bit about what Laureen means to you now, having having spent so much time exploring her and talking to people who knew her, and there are not very many people left who did. Did your experience of her work and her life change through making the film, and where has that gotten you to from where you started?
One of the things I loved about the project as a whole is it took me to places in Wisconsin that I had never explored before. And being a Wisconsin native, my life sort of my life experiences of Wisconsin were somewhat restricted to the Milwaukee area and north of Appleton area. And I really didn't explore the Southwest that much. There were a lot of places in between I hadn't explored either that much, like Horicon Marsh and some other places. So I felt it was my privilege to be able to explore Wisconsin more than I ever had before. And it was her poetry that made me do that. Not only that, but I also went up to Lake Superior and filmed the oar boats. So I called the oar company and I found out approximately, their ships came in on Tuesdays. So I packed my dog and my guinea pig and I got a motel and I drove up there. And as soon as I pulled into the motel, I looked over and there was the oar ship coming in. So then I had to race into town and get the oar ship coming into the dock. And then the next day they let me go behind the scenes and film some more. So it became as much of an adventure for me, as it was to Laureen. When Laureen went there and saw the oar and saw the agates, and I have my own agate collection here from Lake Superior, and I had been collecting those for years because I was familiar with that area, particularly Munising and Marquette, Michigan. Those are places I attended every summer as a kid, and to see it in a different light and to see it through her eyes just was a spectacular experience. And I heard things and saw things I never saw before. So that's an example of retracing some of her steps and how it affected me. So.
But and what we're sort of getting to is this idea of Maureen being a poet of place.
Mm-hmm.
When you just say that, it doesn't, it's sort of flat. It doesn't really mean anything. You
Mm-hmm.
have to really explore the places where she lived and where she experienced to understand what that means. And I think one of the things that, aside from the traveling, which I think is important, but
Mm-hmm.
the fact that she primarily lived in one place for her entire life is what makes it possible for her to be a poet of place.
Mm-hmm.
It's not that she was a superficial traveler to places. She was a really deep explorer of the one place. And so when she was able to travel, it made it possible for her to see those places in a different way.
Well, and one of the examples is that I had gone out to Black Hawk Island many times with Carl Gartung and Paul and other people that had been around. I dragged them out. And one of the times I think that was the most pivoting was when I went out there in the wintertime, and it was really, really cold. And I showed the icicles, and I showed you could see the weathered lines on the side of the cabins where it had flooded, and then all this snow, and some of the doors you couldn't even enter because of the snow. And I was just so impressed by her survival abilities during the winter out there, because there's no protection. So snowdrifts are very large. It really is bitter cold because there's no protection. Everything comes off the lake, and there's very little woods there. So it's harsh. It's harsh.
Yeah, and you have that interview where you talked to, was that Gail Rube that you talked to about 1954 in the winter when she had no money to buy oil?
That was Aeneas.
Aeneas, right.
Yeah, Aeneas. Who? Anne, you know his name. You can unmute your. You have to unmute your. There you go.
Okay, Aeneas McAllister was his name.
Thank you. Yes, and he was a pianist. He also played classical music, and so she, in one of the poems and one of the stories that he told about her, is that she was walking and she heard this sound coming out of one of the cabins, and that lured her to his cabin, and she basically made friends with him at that moment, and they sat down and listened to classical music for hours. But that I just found that so fascinating.
Well, but of course, what I took away was, if she's so cold that she's got to wear all of her clothes to live through the winter, what is it like to write poetry when your hands are so cold?
Yeah.
And to read a book. I mean, she was a voracious reader and a really, really incisive thinker about words and other people's writing. And it's hard to imagine the concentration that she had, the dedication that she had, and being cold and just, that's hard. It's not easy.
Well, what you do is you sit very close to the stove. I mean, it's true. When I lived in New York, I had a coal stove. I had no central heat, and I had a coal stove, and it was very cold. Jenny can attest to this. Paul can attest to this. Other people have been there. There were times where it did not get above 55, and you just sat close to the stove, and that's how you survived. And so everything was right around that area. And I'm sure that's something she did too, but her place was not that large.
No,
So, yeah.
I think you get a really good feeling for the isolation there.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't feel that she was, in fact, she was isolated in some ways, but she was part of a community in other ways. And of course, she was always writing letters and having letters written to her by other poets and artists around the world. So she wasn't alone, strictly speaking, but it was a very challenging physical environment for her. You know, when
Mhm.
you talk about the flooding, and she talks about it in the poems, the water coming up to the house. Well, I mean, that's, you know, that happened every spring,
Yeah.
and shoveling mud out of your house all the time.
Mhm.
You know, it was a lot of work.
Mhm.
So I'm just, have you heard from people who have seen the film for whom this was an introduction to Laureen's work?
Uh,
Um,
yes, I have. I've had quite a few students that have contacted me throughout the years, saying that they took a poetry class and Laureen was introduced to them, and they heard there was a, a film out there somewhere, and they've contacted me by email, and I've gotten them DVDs, and they were doing either research papers. Quite a few of them were doing graduate thesis papers on her. So it's been an interesting process. I haven't heard that much lately, but every once in a while I get an email requesting something or asking me about the film in some way or another.
well, in some ways, film distribution is even harder than the distribution of independent publishing and poetry, because,
Mhm.
you
Mhm.
know, I think it's harder for you in a lot of ways than it is for a poet to get their work out.
Well, I could go to a distributor, but I chose not to in this case. I might do that once I get some bugs worked out in the streaming process. I would like to see it be more available, especially through the streaming process. So that's my next step, is to look into that.
Maybe Woodland Pattern can carry it and sell it as well.
I mean, I have DVDs of it, but that's, yeah. So, yeah.
Well, Mike, should we ask if people
Open up
want
questions.
to ask
Yeah.
questions?
And also, I just wanted to mention that Paul Dickinson is here, who did a lot of the sound recording, the nature sound recording. And then also Jen Benka is here, and Jen and I believe Bill Dempsey also. Jen wrote the lyrics for the song at the end, and also Bill Dempsey wrote the music, and the two of them collaborated on that, and they recorded it in the studio. So they're both here as well. And I think Jenny's lyrics were extremely just riveting as far as I'm concerned. When she sent me the lyrics, I just shivered. It was just, she just hit it right on the head. I was very excited about possibly using that in the film. So.
Oh, that's great. Well, yeah, hopefully we can hear from everyone involved and everyone else also. This is wonderful. So again, for this process, it has to be like, you know, a bit more moderated because of the format. So I'll have to like mute and unmute people in turn. So if you have a question and your video is on, or want to, you know, speak and your video is on, just raise your actual hand. If you want to keep your video off, which is perfectly fine, there is, I hope you can find a hand raise icon function built into Zoom, and you can use that so that I can, yeah, somebody's using it. Rye. Yeah, there we go. So let me unmute.
Hi.
Hey. Hi.
Hey, Cathy.
Hi.
Hey, I have a question.
Go for it.
Okay. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your editing process and how you like establish such a like interesting like rhythm throughout the film.
Mm-hmm. Okay, you touched on 2 or 3 things there, so I'm going to cover all of them, I hope. First of all, the film is shot in 16 millimeter film. It's not video. It was then later, it was transferred to digital. So I did edit it in a digital format. The choice of 16 millimeter film was a very deliberate one. And that was that if I were alive and doing a documentary or doing a film about Laureen in the 60s and 70s, that would have been my format. And so I chose it because I thought it reflected the graininess, the color, everything else about it, the restrictions of it. I felt it really reflected her poetry and her time of production of her own work. As far as the rhythm, her poetry is constantly using. She's constantly using editing. She's constantly using rhythm in her words and her phrases. And I decided that she also talked about sounds having rhythms. And so I decided to edit in a similar fashion. And that is to edit in rhythms with my imagery as though they were actually words, almost as though somebody was talking. So there's sometimes, for example, the spider web sequence, there's the sequence of, I think after Carl Gartung says, there's a montage of her living in New York, and he says, and then she went back to New York. She went back to Black Hawk Island from New York. And then I have a string of images that are cut rhythmically, and there's no dialogue whatsoever or no voiceover. And those to me were poems in themselves, visual poems. So the rhythm itself was using her poetry to sort of dictate my editing, but that's also how I edit. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, cool,
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. I think Carl has a question.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment. She and Zukowski, Louis Zukowski, had quite a correspondence about film in the mid to late 30s. And he, of course, was completely interested in music, but he was also interested in the montage of film. And the way she constructed her poetry was out of conversations and research, and very much in the way of montage between her dreams and between her research and between her talk. It's incredible. And so to capture that is quite wonderful.
Well, I think that was my intention, was I tend to work in montage style, and that's what I'm comfortable with, but that's also how I sort of think when I put things together. And that was one thing I connected with her on. I have to say that that's something I appreciated about the way that she wrote her poetry, and it was structured.
You did well.
Thank you.
Ronnie, hi. Sorry, I was unmuted or muted.
Okay.
Let me unmute you. Wait, I'm trying, but it won't let me. Hold on one second. I'm sorry, Ronnie. I see you.
There she is.
There we go. Okay.
Okay.
Got it.
Gosh, there's so much to say about what you've done, which I'm very, very taken with, I want to say.
Oh, thank you.
One of the things that struck me was that you didn't identify who you were interviewing, who the speakers were. Very un-Ken Burns way. So I wondered, why did you do that? And then I also wanted to say that I thought that it really was a film made by a woman in appreciation of another woman. And there was some biographical information that you left out. And I wondered why.
Okay,
that's it for me.
I'll address all of that. First of all, I did identify with her as a woman. And ironically, some of my life has also paralleled hers in some ways, that some good things, some bad things, but like my vision is paralleling her, which is unfortunate, but it is what it is. My ownership of houses and being overwhelmed with keeping them up and working on them and and financially being stressed all the time is something that interferes with my art. So I can identify with that with her. The reason for leaving out Zukowski's and Lorene's pregnancy situation, there's several layers to that. One is, at the time when I had made the film, I did not have guaranteed information that that was proven. I personally did not have that. Margot, who wrote A Poet's Life, did go that extra length to find that information and did confirm it through other sources that I just didn't go to. I also just want to state that this is not an autobiography. I mean, this is not a biography film. It's not a biopic. It's more of a tribute to. So there were many things I left out. But yes, that was one thing I did leave out. And the reason I did leave it out is from a woman's perspective. I know there's a lot of film. I mean, I know there's a lot of poetry that she wrote about it. I just didn't feel comfortable putting that in when I was not sure. And I also thought that if I was a woman and somebody was doing a film about me, I really would not want that in the film. That was my decision. Like I said, I had 3 or 4 reasons for not doing it. I've been criticized heavily for not putting it in, but I always have to come back to say that this was a film that I made that was a tribute and a respectful reflection of how I saw her creative process and how my creative process interchanged with hers. That's the most of it. Does that make sense?
Mute myself.
Did that make sense, Ronnie?
I'm trying to unmute myself. Okay.
Okay.
Yes, it makes absolutely perfect sense. And
Yeah.
another place where I saw that was in talking about when she became a cleaning person and the nobility of the cleaning, which very often is not given in the accounts of Laureen. The tributes that Laureen gave to the people with whom she lived, these were not yokels. These were the people who had great integrity. And so it's not just Laureen that you give integrity to, I think. It's the whole community of which she was a part.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. Any other questions?
All right, Peter.
Hi, well, great to see the film. It's been since Centenary Conference, I think. But I had a question about fame. I think that's addressed in Jen's song,
Mm-hmm.
as well as the ending with Al Millen. And I guess it just occurred to me, like, how would she take this fame? And what does it say about us, her fans and readers, wanting her to have that fame? Like, would she want that fame? Is it more about us than it is about her? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I don't know how to answer that, to be honest. I keep thinking about the recording of her and how she giggled and how she was so innocently responding to this new experience of being recorded. And I think in some ways she was actually very thrilled about it. So I'm not sure if you know, I don't really know. I have no clue. Anybody else have a suggestion or an idea? Because I'm yeah.
Well, I
Go
was
ahead.
going to say, I thought that one of the things that really was important about your film is that you highlighted how much Laureen's work and life has been identified for her by others, or was at the time, and that you know, the question about fame goes to that. I think she was seeking to define herself at every single opportunity. You know, when she says she didn't want to be seen as a freak by the locals who would have thought her that from being a poet, but she was perfectly happy to be seen as a freak by a professor. I think that's very revealing. And I think I don't think she would have objected to what we are calling fame, because I think what she wanted was to be read, and she wanted people to hear her voice on the page. That's enough. She didn't care. And in the purest sense of being an artist, her life to her was not what mattered. What mattered was what she put on the page. And in that way, fame isn't, it's kind of goes with that. You want to be read. You want people to read your work. And I think she has succeeded in that.
I think Carl has a question.
Okay. See Carl with the hand up, yeah. Okay, Carl, hi.
Well, I just wanted to comment. She damn well knew who she was in terms of how good a poet she was, and she wanted to be recognized as a poet. That's number one. She was not very interested in injecting her personal autobiography or her personal scandals into as something for us all to gab about. Probably she wouldn't have been very interested in that. But regarding that reading that she did with Sid Corman, yeah, she was very uncomfortable with readings and very skeptical about poetry out loud, although she certainly enjoyed visits from Bunning and Jonathan Williams and others who were very much involved in that, and she respected that. But then after she did that tape, she had several letters where she comments in detail about how that might change the way she would write, that would change the way she would use the language to a certain extent. And I think if she'd lived longer, we would have seen that. I really do.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thanks, Carl.
Thomas has a question.
Thomas, hold on. Yep. Hi.
I was just curious about Paul Hayes. I see from the Lehman book that he wrote about the marriage, her marriage. Where was that? Where did he write about her?
He wrote an article in the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel.
Really? Huh.
Yes, and if you asked me that question a few years ago, I would have been able to tell you exactly the date, but I don't remember it. It's in my box of research somewhere. But it was written by, maybe Anne knows. I don't know. Do you know Anne? Anne knows.
It was in the Wisconsin State Journal, and Julie Chesso, he extensively interviewed Julie. He also gave the paper for that article at the centenary,
Yes.
which really changed a lot of thinking about Al Millen. It was significant. We have a copy of that in our collection, as does the museum. I'm trying to think if it's digitized. If you email me through the website, I can find you the exact date and see if I can get you a copy of that digitally.
Yeah, I think he would have been retired from the Journal Sentinel by 2003.
Yes, he had been retired. It's a wonderful article, though. You should try to read it. It's wonderful. Yeah. Thank you, Anne. That was I got I knew he was with the Journal Sentinel, but I wasn't sure. Yeah, there. Oh, thank you so much. Carl has it.
Oh, and
Carl has it right there.
Oh, it was Wisconsin Magazine. Well, that was a Journal Sunday magazine.
Yeah, can you hold it up again, Carl? The title of it?
It was the Sunday magazine.
Yeah. Oh, okay. So.
Yeah.
Ah, great.
It's really wonderful. And what Anne was talking about as far as things changing after that article was written is that there was a softness of, like, Julie Sasso, who is his daughter. You know, I think Julie felt better about the marriage, you know, the reflection of it. And you know, lots of people were criticizing the marriage for quite a while. And so I think there was a really nice warmth that came from that article that people responded to.
The centenary, you must know that Julie was pretty offended. I don't think I'm giving anything away about that. And when Paul got up to give that paper, there had already been a lot of criticism in the context of the conference about Al Millen and the fact that her papers were burned. When Paul made that presentation, you could hear palpable silence sort of fall over that auditorium conference. And it was kind of a aha moment, I think, for a lot of people, including Sid Corman, who was there. And so that allowed a greater relationship between the Friends of Lorraine Niedecker and Julie, which has been very significant to our learning more about Lorraine as a person. And also she's been very generous with the artifacts as well. So that, Carl, someday we need to do an article about all of the things that turned from that centenary, but that was one of the more significant in my view.
And what was so spectacular is that Julie allowed Paul and I to come to her home, and we spent, Paul, I think about 5 hours there, maybe 6 hours there. We were there for a long time.
And that relationship with Paul was, that helped all of that.
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh.
Yeah, I was speaking of Paul Dickinson, my collaborator with the sound collaborator. She allowed us to come over and was bringing out boxes that she had never opened before. Literally, they were stashed away, and she was bringing out boxes. And once she started bringing out one box, and we were all oohing and eyeing, then she'd bring out another box and another box. And so I think it was a wonderful feeling for her that we were so interested in, and what she was showing us was just spectacular. I couldn't get over it. It was just like seeing magic appearing in front of my eyes. I didn't know about any of it.
Nobody did.
Nobody did.
Wow.
Yeah.
I also loved your montage of the south side of Milwaukee when she was living there. That was great.
Thank you. That was I lived in Milwaukee for 14 years, so I know about the bar on every corner, and I know about the churches on every corner, and I just had to do something similar. So, visually, I had to do something similar.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Any other questions, thoughts? Chuck?
Hi, Chuck.
Hi, Cathy.
Hi, Chuck.
I'd love to hear from Paul about the soundscape and any field recordings out at Black Hawk Island in the seasons.
What would you like to know? You hear me?
You're a little
okay?
soft.
Oh, okay. What
That's
would you
better.
like to know? Most of the recording, most of the recordings that were used in the film were done, they originated either on Black Hawk Island there or at Cat's place up in near Wapaka there. And I just kind of in the way that Cathy kind of allowed Lorraine's poetry to kind of direct how she was creating the imagery. I kind of was thinking about the sound in the same way, where when you have a close relationship to a specific place, there are sound signatures in that place that just kind of like, oh, it's, they indicate either time of day or season or things like that. So that's kind of what I was thinking about in terms of the recordings.
Mm-hmm. 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 And I just want to add that the sounds came from numerous places. Some things Paul had recorded in the Boundary Waters, some things at my lake place, some things were at Black Hawk Island, and then he also has his own detailed archive of nature sounds from numerous other places. So I would go through and sometimes select things that I thought were appropriate. Mm-hmm. Jen has a question.
Yeah. Hello, I'm going to unmute. Hi, Jen.
Hi. Hi, Cookie.
Hi, Jenny.
And hi, everyone. It's so great to see all of your faces. Many old friends on the screen. I don't have a question. I just have a comment or appreciation for Cathy Cook. The way that you took Niedeker's poems into your whole being. And like you said, composed from a very similar place visually is just, I think, remarkable. And it was just a gift to watch the film again today and to remember, you know, I was hanging out with you when you were making this, and you know, I remember you setting up some props in your loft by the Navy Yard with your cast iron stove, with your jacket. I mean, very similar to the way in which Niedeker was composing. So it's just, I don't know, it's just so breathtaking, Cook, how you just brought her art into your own. And I'm so glad that this film exists and that more people get to know Niedeker through you, and more people get to know you through Niedeker.
Well, thank you very much, Jen. And also thank you for sending me giving me the first book. But like, I have so many of her books, and this is what they look like. And these are, they're just like marked and marked and marked with, just like, and it's, the more I knew about her and how she marked books, then I went back and I looked at the way I marked books, and I was like, whoa, she was writing notes and everything, and I've got notes and everything, and I've got color coded, and I just really connected with her in so many ways. And the only thing I didn't do parallel to her is I didn't get married at 60. So that I didn't do. But there's a lot of parallel things, and I just, I have to thank you for giving me that first book. Yeah. So, any other questions or?
Okay, and I see a little hand raised icon. Oh.
By the way, Bill Dempsey is here also. He did the instrumental and helped write the music for the final piece in the film.
Well, and I might just quickly jump on the fan club and also want to really thank Woodland Pattern. And I had the honor of living around the corner from Woodland Pattern for years, and it's great to see Carl on here again. And it's like a family reunion here in so many ways. Cook, I was just interested if you could speak to, you started to speak to this a little earlier, but did you feel any pressure to go down that road of like, we need the authoritative academic voice to come on and declare her importance? I mean, I love the fact that it's actual voices of Wisconsinites that you can definitively hear in this film. And I'm just interested if you could speak to that. And also just want to shout out Paul Dickinson's work, who's just, such an integral part of this experience, is that soundscape that was put together. Obviously, Cook, your brilliant visual work and bringing all these pieces together. But I was just interested if you had any reflections on that.
Okay, so, and somebody asked earlier, and I did not finish answering this question, why I didn't identify the people that were doing the voiceovers. And part of it is, I just felt it would have been distracting. I wanted it to feel as though I was walking through the neighborhood or finding these people as I was exploring, and I was talking to them. And I felt that if I took it and identified them and told people who they were and made it more of a documentary style, that I would have lost that flow. And that was just a personal approach for me and a personal decision for me. I struggled with that. What was the other part of your question? I'm sorry, Bill.
I think that covers it. And I'm just sort of a fan of the voices that popped up in the film. And if you have and it speaks to your knowledge of the state and the region, and you know, you just embodied that in so many ways.
Mm-hmm. I also wanted to touch on something else about the soundtrack, is that she often talked about hearing things. And so I felt oftentimes when she would talk about hearing some things, I might try to use that as a cue for an image. I also, when I'm at my lake house, which is a small little house, and it's literally, the lake is not very far away, and the front of the lawn is always soggy because I'm so close to the water. I hear things like that she states in her poems, like I hear spring's first frog, and I hear muskrats gnawing on my doors. I do hear chipmunks running through my walls. I hear frogs sing. And these are all things that she put in her poetry, but they're all things that I experience. And the hearing part is very important. I hear the coyotes at night. I hear the deer trying to walk quietly past my window at night, but I can hear them snorting, you know, and they do that snort thing that they don't think anybody else is hearing them, but it definitely wakes me up. So that was another sound cue that I took from her as far as building on images.
Great, thank you. Anybody else have questions? Thoughts?
Bill?
Well, oh, yeah.
We have the woodland pattern gals. Question.
Yes, hold on. Oh, nope. There it is. Yeah.
Hi.
Hi.
So we're just extremely grateful. I think both Laura and I loved Lorraine before we moved to Wisconsin, and I think all of you know that we have only been here just over 2 years.
Mm-hmm.
It's been an intense and beautiful and strange 2 years, but one thing that is wonderful is to realize the deep love for Lorraine here, and to watch so many serious artists, both like sonically, visually, and people who are writing on the page, which is all what Woodland Pattern too is. But to see Lorraine filtered through all of those really close things to Wisconsin, and have her poetry come even closer to this regional experience that it's supposed to be, that I think that was something that I couldn't access quite as intimately, definitely, until I was able to hear this conversation or see this film, or, you know, get to know some of what's gone on here. So I thank you all for that deep engagement and letting us feel more home in both her poetry and here at Woodland Pattern.
Well, thank you. And I also want to put a thank you to Carl Garton, who is extremely helpful in connecting me with numerous people. Absolutely essential. And Anne Engelman was also very essential. It was like an open book. They just said, what do you want to know? And it was fantastic. So thank you very much.
Any other thoughts, questions? This really has been incredibly wonderful. It's the depth and engagement around Niedecker, and I thank you, Cathy and David, so much for being here, and everybody for just bringing these incredibly thoughtful questions and insights. This was really, really wonderful.
Thank you, everybody.
Yeah.
Thank you, David, too. I got to know David, so that was great.
I really enjoyed this.
Mm-hmm. Me too. Thank you.
Yeah, and oh, sorry, were you waving, or is it okay? Okay. Just saying. Okay, yeah, just making sure.
People are now bringing their pets on board. So.
Yeah, right.
Zippy, come here. Zippy, come here.
Well, yeah, again, thank you all so much. And yeah, you could, the film will be available on that Vimeo page for another several hours. So watch it again and again and again.
Or tell other people.
And share. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And yeah, okay. So thanks so much. We have this awkward goodbye now.
For having us.
Appreciate you.
Thank you.
Hi, Carl. Hi, Cinda.
Bye. Thank you. Good to see you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye, Cathy.
Bye. Bye.